Ancient Rome is often depicted as an empire of soldiers, conquest, and grand monuments. But what about those who couldn't fight or march? Today we are uncovering the story of a young individual with a disability who lived in Roman Britain over 2,000 years ago. What can their bones reveal about the care they received? And how does their life change our assumption about disability in ancient times? This is The Resurrectionist. To the Resurrectionist podcast. This week we will be talking about a topic which is near and dear to my heart because this particular research is mine. I did it. It's me. It's my master's dissertation, which I have on the table. If you're watching the video version of this on YouTube, it's my nice hardback version. Did I need a hardback version? No. The actual version I submitted was spiral bound and not hardback, but I worked on this for like over 3 months. I deserve a hardback version. So I bought myself one. It was actually fun. I had to read through it again for the first time in a while to write this episode, the script for this episode. It was kind of emotional reading through it. I remember how smart I used to be. I feel like I lost all of that intelligence in the last, 2 years, 3 years almost. So it was fun to remember that I used to have a brain once that functioned. So this week we will be discussing an individual from Kingsholm, Gloucester in the UK who had a somewhat limiting disability, and he was sort of the main subject of my master's research, which overall, my master's research was in the bioarchaeological study of care in Roman Britain, but this one individual was kind of the main focal point of my study, so we'll be discussing him and going over the study in general as a whole. So a little background on Roman Britain. Roman Britain was Roman Britain from 43 AD to 410 AD. There was 2 failed invasions of Britain by the Roman Empire, specifically by Caesar, one in 55 and one in 54 BC, and then Britain was eventually conquered by Claudius in 43 AD. Most of the records we have pertaining to Roman Britain are biased towards the military, so we know quite a bit about the military and military bases and military cities. We don't really know a lot about daily life of just general individuals in Roman Britain. So that was one of the areas of my research, I guess, as well, was more like daily lives of like common people, I guess. So generally it's thought that the Roman Britain was less integrated into the Roman Empire than other provinces were, possibly because it was so far away from Rome itself, also possibly because it was sort of towards the end of the life of the Roman Empire and they may have stretched themselves a little too far at that point. So in order to maintain control, they permitted the native people, I don't know if that's the right word, to hang on to more of their traditions. But like I said, the information we do have is biased towards the military, which would have been Roman people or people who were more integrated into the Roman Empire, and therefore it is difficult to tell what the common person's experience was and if it was more Roman or British. Essentially, this entire topic is difficult to study because it is not well understood, which is why you study things, why you research things, to try and improve your understanding of certain periods and stuff like that. So when it comes to medicine and medical treatment in Roman Britain, again, we don't really know a lot of what's going on. There are evidence of military hospitals in Roman Britain, but there is no evidence of civilian hospitals. We're unsure if medical treatments were more Romanized or whether they were more traditional towards what would have been before the Romans arrived there. We do know that there were some physicians, Roman trained physicians, in Roman Britain, whether they tended to treat only military individuals or all individuals were kind of uncertain about as well. We do have evidence of Roman medical tools, such as like scalpels and these kinds of shoes they use to try and correct clubfoot and stuff like that. But again, these are coming from military bases most of the time, so it's difficult to determine if these are solely being used for military purposes or if everyone was able to avail of these Roman medical treatments as well. So that's just a little background on Roman Britain, what we know about what was going on, possibly. So specifically, the individuals I used from my study were from Kingsholm, Gloucester. Kingsholm was a suburb of Gloucester, which was a military outpost thought to have been founded between 96 and 98. Kingsholm itself was thought to be founded possibly around the 60s AD. They're not really very sure. It seems to be mostly attached to the 20th Legion, so it's possible that they founded it. And by the mid of the 2nd century AD, it had evolved from a military fortress into a town. So in the period I'm talking about, where my individuals come from, it's thought that Kingsholm was just a normal town and that it didn't have any military associations anymore, or no like official military associations anymore. It's possible that there were military people living there from the military outpost at Gloucester, but yeah, technically it's considered a like civilian town at this point. So traditionally the assumption is that Romans and Roman Empire in general didn't really care about people with disabilities, or were cruel to people with disabilities, or like ostracized people with disabilities. Like, this is the sort of traditional belief around disability in Rome and the Roman Empire, but there's really not a lot of like foundation for this belief. I think it sort of mostly just comes from the assumption that people in the past in general, in the vast expanses of the past, didn't care about people with disabilities, and that we just sort of like tack that onto different periods. Like, it's not really a lot of proof that we're basing this on fact, and we're just basing that on the assumption, is what I've gathered about this from my research. But it is actually interesting. I was listening to someone recommended me a podcast episode while I was doing my dissertation on Instagram, and I should have written down the name and I can't remember, but shout out to whoever that person was on Instagram 3 years ago who recommended I listen to this podcast episode where this woman professor who researches disability in ancient Rome was being interviewed, and she was saying that it's possible that individuals with physical disabilities, or like disabilities like that would have left them looking physically different to other individuals, possibly wouldn't have been seen as odd or like different or anything like that, because if you think about it, a lot of occupations back then would have involved manual labor, and manual labor could have led to injuries, and if those injuries didn't heal properly, or like broken bones didn't set properly or anything, they could lead to like malformations, I suppose. Is that the word I'm looking for? Like, just if you broke your leg and your leg didn't set properly, your leg might look a little wonky, you know? And so like people probably would have looked like this a lot back then, and therefore maybe you wouldn't have seen people who are physically disabled as looking different necessarily, or like standing out, because it's possible a lot of people would have looked like that. I will link the podcast episode that I'm talking about, because I cannot think of it now off the top of my head, but I will link it down below. It's actually hosted by one of the guys who did Horrible Histories. It's really interesting. They discuss loads of different topics, but they always have the Horrible Histories guy, an expert in whatever topic they're talking about, and a comedian on to discuss these things. So it's fascinating. You should definitely listen to that episode. It's really good. I'll link it in the reference list. This episode's reference list, I want to say, is going to be slightly different from other ones because it's based off of my own research, which there's like 5 pages of references in this dissertation. I'm not going to link all of them. If you guys want a whole reference list, you can reach out to me and I will send it to you. You can either do that on Instagram at The Resurrection Woman, or you can leave a comment in the comment section if you're on YouTube. I will send you the full reference list. But for the purposes of this episode, I will only link ones that I think will be of general interest to people. So that podcast episode, I'll link to the methodology I was using and like a couple of other things like that. But the entire reference list of my dissertation will not be in the description. One of the things I had to consider when I was doing my dissertation was the language I was using, and I'm not going to claim to be perfect about any of this stuff either in my actual dissertation or especially now when I'm just talking based off of a vague written script that I'm not fully following. But the language around all of this can be very complicated, especially when you're talking about the past. In my dissertation, I tried to solely use the term physically impaired versus disabled. It's just, there's a lot of nuance and discussion that goes into all of this around like modern language that people use every day. And it's even more difficult when you try and impose that onto the past. So I just want to kind of like go through a couple of those things and like why I was having to discuss the language I was using for this as well. So a disability, or someone who's disabled, is considered to be like an individual's inability to interact with their environment. And there's both a medical and a social sort of view on disability. The medical view of disability seems to be that the individual is incapable of interacting with their environment. And then the social view of disability is that society has not adapted to enable a person to interact. So medical kind of sort of puts the onus on the person that like you are disabled because you can't interact with your environment. Whereas the social way is sort of society and the environment has not evolved to enable you to interact with it. So it's a societal problem, not a you problem kind of thing. It's also kept in mind, and this is the reason why it's difficult to talk about disability in the past, because based off of both a medical and a social definition of disability, disability is dependent on the context. So to give like two examples, a modern example and like a past example. A modern example would be that there are communities of deaf people. And within those communities, deafness is not seen as a disability, or to a lot of deaf people, deafness is not seen as a disability because their community and their environment is adapted to suit them and to work with their inability to hear. So therefore they are not disabled in their society because their society works for them. They're able to interact with their society. And another example would be like dyslexia would not have been seen as a disability in a pre-literate society because the inability or the challenge with reading in a society where reading is not necessary obviously wouldn't impact on your ability to interact with society. So that's what I mean when I say disability is dependent on the context, and why it is difficult to discern disability in the past, because you're discerning an individual's ability to interact with an environment that you possibly do not fully understand, and that interaction between the individual and their society might be difficult to ascertain. Does that make sense? It makes sense when I wrote it down. I don't know if I'm explaining it properly. It's also difficult to sort of discuss disability and a person's ability to interact with their environment because different people can experience disability in different ways. No two people experience it exactly the same way, even if they have the same quote unquote disability. They may not experience that or experience the world or the challenges associated with their disability to the same level. So therefore, it's difficult to say whether they are disabled or if they would have seen themselves as disabled, if society would have seen them as disabled. So That's why when I was doing my dissertation, I stated that people were physically impaired because physically they had something that would impair them versus saying that they were disabled. I still am not sure about the language on that because I've seen different people say different things, that you should use the word disabled or you shouldn't. I'd be very interested to know what you guys think about all of this. So if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to comment below or interact on Instagram. I'll be posting pictures and graphs and everything to do with this on my Instagram, so you can comment there on that post if you have anything to say about this. It is very confusing, ever-evolving matter, and I keep looking into it at different times. I was watching a presentation at a conference recently that was talking about studying the importance of studying disability in the past, and they were saying we should use the term disability. So, I don't know. It's difficult. Another important thing to note is that I can only see impairments that affect the bone. So there's certain quote-unquote disabilities that I cannot see in an osteological record, such as like deafness or mental disabilities. There are certain, like a lot of physical disabilities that don't really affect the bone, so you can't see them, and therefore I cannot say that the individuals in my study are the only individuals that had impairments, because I can't see every impairment or disability that's going on in the site, so that's important to note as well. It's also important to note, like I said, different people experience different disability in different ways, and different people manage to adapt to disabilities in different ways. So if you think of like Paralympians and stuff like that, we've created a lot of adaptions for certain disabilities. Other people just manage to adapt themselves to certain disabilities. I've seen a lot of documentaries on children who were born with disabilities because of thalidomide, who have like just adapted to life because that's how they've always been. So it's difficult to determine how people may have adapted to their disabilities as well. But when it comes to this study, you have to keep in mind that it takes time to adapt to a disability or to an impairment. And therefore, the care I'm talking about would have been needed at some point before they learned to adapt, if they did learn to adapt to their physical impairments. Also important to note, I am discussing health-related care, not emotional care. So the physical care, the act of caregiving that would have been provided to a person, and I'm not talking about the emotional care that would have been given to these individuals as well. So there is a methodology to studying the bioarchaeology of care, and it was developed by Lorna Tilley. I'll leave a link to where you can learn more about the specifics of the methodology in the description below. But the bioarchaeology of care basically is the study of health-related care in the past through bioarchaeological or osteological examination. The sort of best way to do this is to take a multidisciplinary approach, incorporating archaeology, osteology, clinical medicine, history, and anthropology to build out a model of care for the individual or individuals that you're studying. This is a very theoretical approach, so there's always going to be some gray areas associated with it, but by sort of developing a methodology that everyone adheres to, or most people adhere to, it kind of just makes it easier to ensure that at least all the studies that are being done now are kind of on the same level or are approaching things the same way, and are therefore kind of easier to compare to one another and to understand. So there are a lot of studies that talk about specific skeletons, the pathologies they would have had, like go into description, like talking about the pathologies and like what that would have led to and like all of this other stuff. And they might mention that this individual would have needed care, but then they don't go into detail about what kind of care the individual would have needed, how much time that care would have taken, how many people would have been involved, how long the care would have been needed for, like over their lifetime, stuff like that, which sort of only gives you like half the story as well. You're like, okay, this person had this. This would have required care. okay, but what kind of care? For how long? So there's this missing last step when it comes to a lot of studies that are done on the pathology that individuals have. I believe there are 2 papers published previously, which will be in the reference list, on the individual I'm discussing, and I believe both of them kind of mention this as well, where they're like, this individual would have needed care. Full stop. So that's why it's kind of important to take that extra further step sometimes and just look into what care they would have needed to kind of round out the story and put everything into context. So one of the things I didn't really think about until after I'd finished my research, months afterwards. I've presented this research at 2 different conferences, and it was kind of when I was preparing the research for the first conference I was doing that the thought sort of dawned on me that not only does this kind of research give you insight into the individual and into care practices in the past, but it also kind of gives you insight into the caregiver as well. And this individual probably wouldn't really be recorded osteologically or archaeologically. You wouldn't see a caregiver necessarily, and you're not in this seeing a specific skeleton and saying that's the caregiver, but you're more seeing the idea of a caregiver, the sort of, you're building out an individual that would have given care and how much time that care would have taken and how intensive or labor intensive it would have been for that individual. So while you don't have a skeleton you can associate it with, you can sort of build up the image of this caregiver by looking at the individual that would have required care. It's just a thought that kind of dawned on me afterwards. I haven't really looked into it or anything, but I think it's just interesting to think about that this research might also give you insight into an additional person or additional people that you would not be able to see in the archaeological or osteological record any other way. So one of the reasons why I'm sort of fascinated by the bioarchaeology of care is because I love the history of medicine. I'm really interested in the history of disability and physical impairment, but also because I feel like one of the things I love about osteology in general is that it sort of gives you a very human look at the past, as opposed to just looking at a site or, a culture or a town or something like that, something very broad. You're looking at a very individual level, and I feel like the bioarchaeology of care gives you an even deeper look at an individual's experience in the past. And there's this quote I wanted to give you from Ian Hodder, which if you listen to the second episode of the podcast on Chatlahoyach, he's done a lot of research in Chatlahoyach, so that's where you might know the name from if it sounds familiar. But he has this quote that goes, "The public need to sense a human scale in the vast expanse of archaeological time." And that's why I love osteology, because I feel like it gives you that. But I feel like the bioarchaeology of care goes a step further to give you even more of that. Because not only are you saying, this is a man, he was this age, he probably lived with these diseases, you're also going that step further to be and because of that, their life might have looked like this. And it just sort of gives a face to the past, I feel like, which I just find really fascinating and interesting. So let's get very specifically into the exact topic of this episode, which is my study on Kingsholm and this individual from Kingsholm. So the site was excavated in 1987, and there are currently 49 individuals that are held by the University of Bradford from this site. These individuals are thought to date from between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, so this is after the military occupation of Kingsholm has ceased, and it's now more of a public common town. I don't know what you'd call it. It's not a military fortress anymore. It's just a town. So all in all, there were 6 juveniles, 21 females, 14 males, and 8 individuals who were of undeterminate sex. The youngest individual at the site was aged between 4 and 5 years, so there were no infants at the site that I was able to study. And most of the individuals at the site were adults aged between 18 and 40. All in all, 30 of the 49 individuals had pathologies. Of that 38 of them may have had pathologies which may have resulted in chronic pain, but I cannot assess pain. Osteologically, people experience pain differently, and therefore it's very difficult to determine a model of care based off of an individual's need for care because of pain or chronic pain. So I discounted these 8 individuals. So I just wanted to mention that they existed, but that I didn't feel comfortable trying to do a model of care for them. So I discounted them. There were a total of 5 individuals that I did end up using for my study. 4 of these individuals had fractures, which is why they were in this study, the care associated with the fractures that they had. All of these individuals, it seemed that their fractures derived from occupational work, not from interpersonal violence. That was based off of the kinds of fractures they had and just the history of the site in general. It just seemed like they were more occupational than because of any violence going on at the site. And these fractures, while they would have required care, they would have required short-term care. It was mostly just setting wounds or setting the fractures and then ensuring that they maybe didn't work for a couple of weeks to like a couple of months while they healed. So that would have been relatively short-term care. So the one individual, which is the main focus of my research and this episode, is K131, a possible male aged 15 to 16 years at the time of his death. Like I said before, there are 2 previous studies done that go into a lot of detail about the pathology that he had. So if you want to read a lot of detail about that and see photos and stuff, you can go check those out. They'll be in the reference list below. But I'm just sort of going to give an overview of the pathology in very simple language, hopefully simple language here. So if you want more detail, you can check out those papers. So by looking at and measuring all the bones of this individual, I determined that the left humerus, femur, tibia, and fibula were all shorter and thinner than on the right side. So the cortical bone, which is if you kind of think of a bone as a tube, and then it's like hollow in the middle, then the tubey part is the cortical bone. I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of difficult to describe that. The cortical bone on the left side is thinner than on the right side, and you can see this in x-rays. So I'll put up some of the x-rays on the Instagram if you want to check that out. And while the left femur, tibia, and fibula showed more significant size difference and thickness difference than the right side, the left humerus radius and ulna didn't show as much difference between the left and the right side, but they were still smaller and thinner than the right side, just not to the same extreme that the leg bones were. And the muscle attachment sites on the humerus, femur, tibia, and fibula were all a lot lesser than on the left side than the right side. However, the muscle attachment sites on the humerus were slightly more pronounced, or were somewhat pronounced, not as pronounced as on the right side, but definitely more than on the leg bones. The fibula in particular had pretty much no muscle attachment sites visible at all. What I mean when I say muscle attachment site is there are areas of the bone where the muscle attaches to the bone, and this can leave marks on the bone or sort of areas of the bone where you can see where the muscle attaches to it. When there's a lot of activity going on, these muscle attachment sites can get more robust. When there's not a lot of muscle activity going on, these muscle attachment sites get less pronounced. So that's what I'm talking about. The skull was also slightly distorted superior laterally, which means that it was coming out and away from the midline at the frontal bone and the occipital bone, which is the forehead and the bone at the back of the head. The first molars of the maxilla and the mandible showed linear enamel hypoplasia, which means that they had these sort of grooved lines in a spot on the tooth, which happened while the tooth was developing. There was a slight height difference in the lumbar vertebra. The right side was slightly lower than the left side of the vertebra. The left fibula was bowed mediolaterally, meaning that it was bowing outwards. Laterally means out, medial means midline, and so it was bowing at the middle of the bone outwards. It's really difficult to describe. If you want to look at the photos and the x-rays, you can see this a lot clearer. It was also, the fibula was quite flat and had a very smooth surface. Like I said, there were pretty much no visible muscle attachment sites on the fibula. The articulating surfaces of the distal tibia, that means the end of the tibia, the talus and the calcaneus, which is kind of the ankle bone and the big bone in your foot. The articulating surfaces were weird and distorted, and there are photos. There was this really difficult photo I tried to take where I was trying to articulate the calcaneus, the talus, and the tibia all together and like take a photo, and I needed a friend to hold the bones together but also not get her hand in the photo, and it was just very difficult. But I will again include it in the Instagram if you want to check it out. I don't know if it came out very well, but it exists. But basically when they were articulated together, they articulated like not in the right way. There was also a fourth articulating surface on the talus, which is not supposed to be there, and it was articulating with an area of the tibia that it's not supposed to articulate with, suggesting that the foot was positioned in an incorrect manner, permanently positioned in an incorrect manner, because all these articulating surfaces were either wrong, or there were too many, or they were articulating with things they shouldn't articulate with. So the shortening and the thinning of the arm bones and the leg bones suggests disuse atrophy of the left arm and leg, and this basically means that the arm and the leg for some reason weren't being used, and therefore the bone was not developing properly, and it was thinner than the right side where the bones were being used. Now, the muscle attachment sites being slightly more visible in the humerus might suggest that at some point after a period of disuse, the arm started to be used again, and therefore the muscle attachment sites started sort of building back up again at some point, and the articulation of the tibia, talus, and calcaneus suggests unilateral clubbing of the left foot, which is called, bear with me, Telepus equinovarius. Latin. Basically, it means that the individual had a club foot, and that their foot was turned in medially, meaning turned in towards the center of the body. All of this, the disuse atrophy of the arm and the leg, suggests unilateral paralysis on the left side, meaning that the individual was paralyzed in their left leg and their left arm. This, combined with the clubfoot, led to a diagnosis of poliomyelitis, which is polio, with acquired clubfoot. The distortion in the skull and the size reduction on one side of the spine could possibly suggest very slight scoliosis, which can be associated with polio as well. And the linear enamel hypoplasia suggests a period of nutritional stress when the individual was between the ages of 2 and 4. And so this could indicate that the individual acquired polio around the ages of 2 and 4. It's common for very young children to acquire polio, so these two things could be indicative of the individual acquiring polio and developing linear enamel hypoplasia while they had it. There are differential diagnoses for this individual, such as hemiplegic cerebral palsy, I don't know if I pronounced that right, and Erb's palsy with congenital clubfoot. It's really difficult to determine why this individual was paralyzed. in the left arm and the left leg and had clubfoot, and it's just sort of a matter of which diagnosis is more likely. Polio can cause clubfoot because it kind of causes the muscles to contract. So it seems more likely that the individual had polio and it led to the clubfoot versus they had some kind of palsy and then also congenitally had clubfoot in the same area of the body. Either way, the diagnoses or differential diagnoses don't change the long-term care that the individual would have required. They do change the short-term care that the individual would have required in childhood, but they don't change the long-term care, and it's the long-term care that's kind of the main area of study in this regard. So in the short term, if this individual had contracted polio, they may have suffered from vomiting, headaches, high fever, and pain, specifically localized to the legs. This is sort of indicative of acute poliomyelitis. If this is the case, the individual may have been prescribed a diet of barley gruel to have twice a day, which was thought to have helped in reducing fever and vomiting. An animal skin or bladder filled with hot water may have been applied to areas of pain to aid in it. This is sort of the ancient Roman-British version of a hot water bottle. So as with today, if you're having areas of pain or cramping, you put a hot water bottle on it to help ease the pain a bit. So polio at the time, and nowadays even, is generally seen as being very similar to other viral illnesses, and definitely back then it would have been impossible to discern between polio and any other viral illnesses. However, once it led to paralysis, or if there was an epidemic of polio in the area, then it would have been a lot easier to diagnose it as very specifically polio. But back in Roman times, it was more common for them to treat symptoms than to treat diseases, so it wouldn't really have mattered to them what was causing the vomiting, headache, high fever, pain. They just would have treated the symptoms rather than treat a disease. And these symptoms probably would have lasted between 2 and 10 days and would have required a low level of care. This individual, like I said, was a very young child, possibly 2 to 4 years old at the time they contracted this disease, and so providing this level of care for a child probably wouldn't have been seen as abnormal, just a very common thing. Children get sick all the time, so it would have been a low level of care that was probably quite common to give and receive. So that wouldn't have been seen as particularly a particular outlier. It is the long-term care, however, which I find the most fascinating. So after the initial onset of the illness, the individual would have been left paralyzed in the left arm and the left leg, and would have been left with clubbing of the left leg. Overall, the clubbing really wouldn't have had much effect on them in the long term because the leg was paralyzed anyway, so they couldn't have used it to begin with. While paralysis is a possible side effect of polio, it is not a hugely common side effect of polio. I didn't have an exact number or percentage of individuals that are left paralyzed, but some are and some aren't. The most common form of paralysis is in one of the legs. However, it can happen unilaterally in an arm and a leg as well, which is what we suspect happened to this individual. So this individual probably wouldn't have been able to walk because of the paralysis and clubbing of the foot, and then probably wouldn't have been able to use a crutch because of the paralysis in the arm that would have been necessary to function a crutch that would help the leg, if that makes sense. If you can't move your left leg, then you hold a crutch in your left arm, but if you can't also move your left arm, then you can't hold the crutch that is needed to substitute the left leg, if that makes sense. So this individual probably wouldn't have been mobile. If they did need to move somewhere, they probably would have required the assistance of at least one other individual to aid them in mobility. It's possible that they could have done certain activities with one arm. They probably could have fed themselves, clothed themselves, taken care of their own hygiene, just being able to use one arm. However, they may have needed some level of assistance to get into a kitchen or to get into I don't know if they had bathrooms, a washing area, communal bathhouse, possibly. So while they would have been able to care for themselves to some extent with one arm, they would not have been very mobile and therefore would have needed daily care in order to assist in getting to the places they needed to get to do the things they possibly would have been able to do with one arm. It is also possible that they received help in readjusting their posture and their position on a daily basis, because there's no evidence in their skeleton to suggest that they were stuck in one unnatural position for long periods of time. So it's possible that someone was helping to readjust their position and their posture daily or weekly at the very least. It is also possible that they received massage or manipulation of the left arm to help in regaining some of that muscle ability or functionality in the arm that it seems they did gain at a later point in life. So this would have been similar to sort of like physical therapy on the arm to help build back up the muscle and to be able to use the arm to some extent later on. The arm would not have regained full functionality or would not have been able to be used to the same extent that the right arm would. It's possible that they probably weren't able to lift or hold heavy objects, and they probably didn't have proper grip strength, so they probably weren't able to grip things properly either. However, if they did regain some ability to use the left arm, it is therefore possible that they could have used the arm to use a crutch. So while in the initial years of paralysis after the disease, they may have had no mobility and would have required assistance from somebody else to move anywhere, it's possible that if they did regain some mobility in the arm, then they were able to use a crutch and were therefore able to move independently of their caregiver, which therefore would have led to having some more freedom, some more independence, and reduced the level of care that the individual may have required. If they were able to adapt and use a crutch, then it's possible that they may not have required any care at that point because they could have used their right arm to perform daily tasks. It's probable that this individual was not able to participate to the socially expected level of a young Roman-British male. Given his age at the time of death, which was again 15 to 16 years, it's probable that they weren't expected to have a profession yet, but they would have been expected to help around the house, and it's possible that they may not have been able to achieve what was expected of a young male of their age in a Roman-British society. There were different socio-economic classes in Kingsholm and in the Gloucester area in general, and there's nothing in any of the burials to suggest which socio-economic class any individuals belonged to, so we don't know how rich or how poor this individual may have been. However, if the family was rich enough to afford an education for this individual, or for any individual in their family, the education would have been provided by private tutor at home, and therefore their impairment would not have impacted on their ability to receive an education. It would have been purely finance that impacted their ability to receive an education. So we also need to keep in mind that at this time in Roman Britain, slaves were something that most households had, and therefore this individual's care may have been the responsibility of a slave and not a parent or a sibling in the household, which also may have contributed to their care not being seen as a burden or an inconvenience, because caring for the individuals in the household would have been a slave's responsibility anyway, and this individual would not have needed a great amount of care or a full-time amount of care, I suppose, so it may not have been seen as a great burden to the household to care for them. I know that's not a great term to use, but when we're kind of trying to eke out what this means for the society, it's kind of, I don't know, a better language to use. I apologize. If you can think of one, please comment below. So like I said, this individual, if they contracted this paralysis because of poliomyelitis or polio, then they probably contracted the disease around the ages of 2 to 4, and they lived until the ages of 15 to 16. So they lived with this paralysis for about 10 years, give or take. And while the level of care they needed would not have been full-time care, it was long-term care for this period of approximately 10 years. Like I said, if they regained mobility in the arm enough to be able to use a crutch, then it's possible they may not have required any care anymore and would have been able to take care of themselves. We also need to keep in mind that most of this 10 years, or all of this 10 years, would have been while they were a child. And again, this level of care may have been seen as common or normal or not entirely odd to be giving to a child, because children require some additional level of care anyway, so it might not have been seen as out of the norm to be providing care for this child, even though they may have required slightly more care than other children. Children are receiving more care than adults anyway, so that might have been playing into it as well. There are treatments for clubfoot that were known in the Roman period. However, they're usually not attempted on individuals who contracted clubfoot. It's usually attempted on infants right after they are born, which also leads to the theory that this was a contracted clubfoot because there's no skeletal evidence that they tried to correct the clubfoot. Also possible that there was no one around who knew how to do that, but we do know that they were treating clubfoot in Rome, and also specifically in Rome and Britain, because there are evidence of these shoes that they used to correct clubfoot in Rome and Britain. So someone knew how to do it there. Maybe not anyone in this town, but thought that was interesting to note as well. Also interesting to note that in the period that this individual would have required help to be mobile, it's possible that they were isolated to their home for long periods of time. If they required somebody else's help to move anywhere, it's possible that they weren't being moved very often, and that they were maybe only being moved around the house and not out of the house very often. So it's possible that their caregiver was the only person they had interaction with during the day while other people were out working, which is something to think about. Again, I'm not going to go into like emotional care or anything like that, but I do think that that's interesting to think about as well. So this individual received a normative burial for the site and also for Roman Britain during this period. They were placed facing west-east, supine, which means flat on their back, with their arms across their torso, and there was 7 coffin nails found in the grave cut, suggesting that they were buried in a coffin. Some studies from Rome in general, not Rome and Britain, have suggested that individuals with disabilities were buried together but separate from the rest of the population, and that's not being seen here. So it is possible that this person was not seen as other or ostracized in any way. Obviously, it's kind of difficult to tell because we don't know a lot about this society, so we don't really know what's going on here. And it is also possible that they were not seen as other by or as an outcast or whatever by one person, and that one person decided to bury them normally, not society as a whole, if that makes sense. But at the same time, if it was a social norm to bury individuals with disabilities or impairments separate to everyone else, you'd think that they wouldn't permit that person to be buried, even if their parent or caregiver wanted them to be buried with everybody else. So it's possible that they weren't seen as other or an outsider because of their impairment. Also to note, we don't have any information on how this individual died, and they did die at a young age. So obviously how they died could play into this. It's possible that they got sick and died of something. I'm sure if they had contracted polio, that it probably weakened their immune system to some extent. I'm not an expert on polio, so I don't know what the long-term effects would have been in the Roman-British period, but that's also something to think about, is we don't know how this individual died, and they did die at a young age, so that could also be playing into something. All of this is to say that it doesn't appear that this individual was abandoned or ostracized, because they were cared for by at least one person. So at least one person did not abandon or ostracize them. It's difficult to extrapolate that to society as a whole, especially a society that we don't really know a lot about, but we do know that at least one person was willing to provide long-term care for this individual. So that is the story of K131. I think it is a fascinating case study of an individual with a physical impairment or a disability in the Roman-British period that we can see was clearly cared for a long period of time. Obviously, there's a lot we don't know, and it's difficult to determine what this says about the society that this individual lived in. I'm hoping you can sort of see from this episode what I mean about the bioarchaeology of care, kind of giving you a better insight into the people in the past, like very specifically, like this one person, this is what their existence may have been like in the past, and that's why I find this really fascinating. I also kind of hope you can see what I was talking about in the beginning when I was just mulling over the idea of whether or not we can extrapolate some information about a potential caregiver in the past as well. But I just wanted to introduce you guys to the bioarchaeology of care because it is something that I'm very interested in. I'm also very interested in medicine and healthcare in general. I'm kind of getting more interested in Roman Britain specifically, but like I said, there's not a lot of information, so it is difficult to eke things out, which is why I think I find it even more interesting, because when you do find out something new, you're like, wow, I didn't know that before, and that was really difficult to find. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I apologize if it seems like disconjointed or there's some background noise. Every single person in my house decided to take a shower one after the other, and my room is right next to the bathroom. So thanks, fam. That's real swell for you there. We do have 2 bathrooms. The shower's been broken in one of them for like 3 years, and no one's been bothered to fix it. But anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you all in next week's episode. Bye!